Modern poetic technique can be summarized as a re-emergence and wholehearted embrace of metaphor. Poets effectively tap into universal themes by first delving into the specifics of the particular. They don't start with abstract ideas and then adorn them with concrete details. Rather, they immerse themselves in the details, honoring them, and from this immersion, they extract whatever broader meaning they can. This meaning must naturally arise from the specific details and should not feel forced upon. In poetry, our usual way of using language needs to be flipped on its head. The specifics or the tale take precedence over the general or the dog. More aptly, it is like the tail of a kite, which gives the kite its flight, transforming it from a mere paper framework into something soaring and alive. Though the tail seems to counteract the kite's purpose of weighing it down, similarly, the concrete details the poet embraces may seem to contradict their aspiration for universality, to convey something meaningful. So, why do they express it indirectly through metaphors rather than directly? Through metaphors, there is a risk of only partially or obscurely conveying the message or even failing to communicate it altogether. However, this risk is necessary because straightforward statements tend toward abstraction and take us away from the realm of poetry entirely. The commitment to metaphor implies, in terms of overarching themes, an approach of indirection. Regarding specific images and statements, it implies an organic relationship where each element of the poem is connected to the others, not as standalone beautiful images, but as integral parts of a growing plant. The beauty of the poem is akin to the blossoming of the whole plant, requiring not just the flowers but also the stem, leaves, and hidden roots. If we think of a poem as a small play, we can understand that its overall impact comes from all its parts working together. In a good poem, just like in a good play, every element serves a purpose and there are no unnecessary parts. As we realize that the components of a poem are interconnected and indirectly related to the main theme, we see the importance of context. Even the most memorable lines in poetry, those that seem inherently poetic, gain their poetic quality from their specific context. For Shakespeare's "Ripeness is all" may seem poetic because it's profound or eloquent, but its true poetic resonance comes from the situation in which it appears. This becomes evident when we compare it to less poetic lines like "Vitality is all," "Serenity is all," which lack impact without their dramatic context, such as in King Lear. These instances can be seen as examples of how context loads particular words, images, or statements with significance. When charged with context, images become symbols and statements become dramatic expressions. Context also shapes the meaning of a statement, sometimes in an ironic manner. Irony, such as sarcasm, involves a complete reversal of meaning due to the context, often emphasized by tone of voice. However, even subtler modifications by context can be significant in conveying irony or other effects, as seen in works like Gray's Elegy. In Gray's Elegy, the question asked is obviously rhetorical. The answer is implied by describing the breath as affecting and the ear of death as dull and cold. The form of the sentence is a question. The way it is asked shows it is not genuine question at all. These are clear examples of irony and much more poetry than readers might realize contains irony. Many of Hardy's poems and most of Houseman's, for instance, exhibit irony as clearly as this. However, irony is not limited to the sardonic. It encompasses various forms like tragic irony, self-irony, playful, arc, mocking, or gentle irony. What statement would truly lack any ironic potential? a statement that did not show any qualification of the context. The only statements that fit this bill are abstract ones like 2 plus 2 equals 4 or the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the two sides. These statements are abstract and purely denotative with no actual implications. But connotations matter in poetry and significantly shape the poem's meaning. Additionally, poems never contain purely abstract statements. Any statement made in a poem is influenced by the context and has its meaning adjusted accordingly. In other words, statements in poems should be interpreted as if they were lines in a play, with their relevance, appropriateness, rhetorical impact, and meaning inseparable from. This principle may seem obvious, but it's nonetheless crucial. It sheds light on why the term irony is so often used in modern criticism. While the term may have been overused or misused at times, it has been the primary way to refer to a general and significant aspect of poetry. In Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach, the speaker states that the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams has really neither joy nor love nor light. For some readers, this statement may seem like an obvious truth, akin to what a typical Hemingway character might express in a different way. However, for other readers, the statement may appear false or at least highly questionable. Trying to prove this proposition would lead to perplexing metaphysical questions and would likely take us away from understanding the poem's essence. Instead, the validity of the statement and of the poem itself must be judged within the context. The speaker stands beside a loved one, looking out at the calm sea, listening to the sound of the ebbing tide, and observing the beautiful illusion of moonlight that illuminates the scene. Validating the truth of the statement requires us to consider this test. Does it appear coherent, mature, and grounded in experience? This leads us to view the poem as a kind of drama and prompts questions about the speaker's emotional state and objectivity. We need to assess whether the statement emerges naturally from the context, acknowledges its pressures, and whether it is ironic or merely shallow and sentimental. Brooks suggests that a poem meeting Eliot's test aligns with I.A. Richards' concept of poetry of synthesis, which incorporates elements seemingly at odds with its dominant tone. Such poetry, by fusing diverse elements, achieves a coherence that makes it impervious to irony. Invulnerability to irony indicates a stable context where internal pressures balance and support each other, akin to the stability of an arc where opposing forces ensure structural integrity. In many poems, contextual pressures manifest through obvious ironies. Examples include Marvel's To His Coy Mistress, Raleigh's Nymph's Reply, and even Gray's Elegy, where irony is apparent even to readers who strictly interpret it. Can other poems be analyzed under this principle, showing a similar underlying structure? The lyric, particularly the symbol lyric, poses an interesting case study. Take, for instance, one of Shakespeare's songs. The song attempts to answer the question, who is Sylvia? By portraying her as both angelic and divine, she surpasses ordinary mortals because of her virtues, described as being holy, fair, and wise, which are seen as heavenly gifts. While grace may initially refer to her graceful movement, considering her other virtues and the mention of heaven lending her grace, it's hard to ignore the theological implications. Shakespeare's audience, being more religious themes, would likely have noticed this as well. This layering of meanings adds richness to the poem and approaches irony. The motive behind Sylvia's bestowed grace, that she might be admired, seems oddly untheological. Furthermore, the reference to love repairing to her eyes, not as Christian charity but as Cupid's influence, adds complexity. The phrase for beauty lives with kindness gains depth, suggesting that Cupid resides in Sylvia's kind eyes. The blending of pagan myth and Christian theology may seem like a confused mix, but it's more likely a clever combination by the poet. It's not a mistake, and if done unconsciously, it is a fortunate one. The song is charming and delightful, showcasing how lovers often perceive mortal women as possessing divine qualities. The poem's light touch and lyrical grace create a common. While this example involves Shakespeare, who lived during the time of the metaphysical poets known for their ironic complexity, similar innocent and convincing examples can be found in Wordsworth's Lucy poems. In the poem, the question arises, is Lucy more like a violet or a star? The overall concept seems to lean towards the comparison with a violet. The violet, beautiful yet often overlooked, symbolizes Lucy's unobtrusive nature. By the end of the poem, she is buried and only the poet mourns her loss. However, the comparison to a star may initially seem less fitting, yet it can be justified as well. To her lover, Lucy is like the solitary star, unmatched by any other. She doesn't compete or consider herself superior. She is simply herself. Both the violet and the star symbolize different aspects of Lucy's character, unseen by the world yet radiant to her lover. This contrast echoes themes often explored by John Donne, where lovers, insignificant in society's eyes, become each other's entire world. Wordsworth does not emphasize this irony as Donne might have, but it is still present in this poem, as it is in many of his successful lyrics, including A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal. While Wordsworth's approach of symbol juxtaposition without highlighting the ironic contrast is valid, it is worth noting that the potential for irony exists in his poem, as it does in much of his work. The lover's lack of concern for mortality is seen as a spiritual lethargy or a peculiar slumber. The phrase human fears is flexible and can mean both fears for the loved one's mortality or normal human fears. The line suggests that the lover does not fear for the loved one's mortality as she is beyond earthly limitations. In the second stanza, the irony becomes more evident. The lover's awakening from his slumber is prompted by the realization that the loved one is now motionless and unresponsive. Instead of describing her as still as marble or clay, Wordsworth imagines her caught in violent motion, akin to the motion of the earth's rotation. This image conveys the sense of her inertness and helplessness as she is now subject to earthly limitations. The whirl of earth's rotation symbolizes the girl's entrapment in earthly time, contrasting with the divine and the immortal image she had in the first stanza. While Wordsworth does not explicitly points out the ironic contrast between the lover's previous slumber and the loved one's current slumber, he does emphasize the irony of her immunity to earthly years. In the first stanza, she seemed divine and immortal, but in the second stanza, she remains unaffected by earthly years because she feels nothing at all. Though not explicitly highlighted, this contrast is evident and adds depth to the poem. Should we label Wordsworth's poem as ironical? Not necessarily. Brooks merely explores why one might be tempted to call such a poem without insisting that it must be categorized as such. He believes Wordsworth's poem is admirable on its own merits, regardless of any comparison to Donne. His aim is to highlight that both Wordsworth and Donne as poets share a similar dynamic structure in their work, where each part of the poem interacts with and influences the whole. However, suggesting potential ironies in Wordsworth's lyric might seem to misrepresent it. Isn't it simple and spontaneous? These terms were critical buzzwords in the 19th century, just as ironical is becoming in our own time. But are simplicity and irony mutually exclusive? Simple and spontaneous can refer to how easily a poem came to be or how it appears to the reader, but they shouldn't blind us to complexities within. Modern poetry often employs irony as a key strategy for various reasons, including the breakdown of common symbolism, skepticism about universals, and the degradation of language by mass media. Modern poets face the challenge of revitalizing language worn down by commercial influences. Critics who attribute the use of irony to the poet's own cynicism should consider the impact of a culture saturated with commercialism. Despite these challenges, many modern poets have successfully used ironic techniques to convey clarity and passion. Randall Jarrell's 8th Air Force is an example of such success. There are no unnecessary parts in the scene described. The airmen in their living quarters appear genuine and casual. Despite being referred to as murderers later on, they exhibit compassion and humanity by caring for a puppy. However, the presence of the puppy could also imply that the living quarters themselves are akin to a wolf's den. The second stanza elaborates on the theme. While some men play a game and one sleeps, at least one man is awake and acknowledges the grim reality of their situation. Yet this acknowledgement is quickly dismissed with the justification that it is just things are in war. The introduction of the Pontius Pilate metaphor in the third stanza adds depth to the poem. Initially portrayed as a figure who questions truth in a mocking manner, Pilate later becomes a symbol of moral judgment. The speaker, who identifies with both the condemned and the judge, grapples with the question of whether humanity is inherently cruel or capable of redemption. The speaker's internal struggle reflects the broader societal dilemma of whether humanity's potential for good is genuine or merely an illusion. The speaker, feeling conflicted, must confront his own past actions and reconcile them with his hopes of humanity's better nature. The phrase, men wash their hands in blood as best they can be interpreted in multiple ways. It could mean acknowledging one's own wrongdoing and reframing from judging others, recognizing that despite one's flaws, there is still a capacity for justice and goodness, or acknowledging humanity's efforts to maintain decency despite difficult circumstances. Each interpretation adds to the overall meaning of the statement, and none of them negate the others. Together, they provide a comprehensive understanding of the phrase. In Randall Jarrell's poem, this phrase is used to convey the complexity of human nature and the difficulty of maintaining moral integrity in challenging situations. While some of Jarrell's poems may appear weaker due to heavy-handed approach to themes of human goodness, in this poem, the affirmation of humanity's by a Pilate figure who washes his hands in blood offers a nuanced perspective. It is important not to misunderstand the role of irony in Jarrell's poetry. Irony does not necessarily diminish the theme of human goodness, but rather adds depth and complexity to it. The goal of poetry is not just to reflect the poet's personal beliefs, but to accurately and honestly portray the human experience, inviting readers to participate in the poetic insight and potentially become better citizens through that engagement. Ultimately, good poetry transcends abstract beliefs and connects with readers on a deeper level, rooted in concrete experience and enriched by various perspectives and tensions within the text.